Welcome back to SNS University. I'm Coach Joe Cristando. Today's lecture is common technical faults in the squat and how to fix them. So we're going to start with the setup. This is often an overlooked aspect of not just the squat, but the squat, bench, and deadlift. But particularly in the squat, it's crucial to a good rep and a good squat, and there's often a lot of room for optimization. They're very small details that add up to a bigger picture. So I'm just going to introduce a few topics regarding this, and then I'm going to go to the bar and we're going to demonstrate some things. The first two are actually not really technical faults, but more so mobility requirements, and often a lacking in that department. So the first one is scapular retraction, which is absolutely essential to a good setup. And the second one is external rotation. This particularly applies to the low bar squat and not as much for the high bar, but today this is mostly just low bar talk. So let's take a walk to the bar and then we'll do some demonstration. So as I mentioned, the first two things we're going to talk about are more so mobility requirements, and scapular retraction and external rotation. These two things together allow you to create maximum tension right from the start. And if you're lacking in the two, you're going to have a hard time doing this. So I'm going to demonstrate a setup with poor scapular retraction and a setup with, I don't have the best scapular retraction, but better scapular retraction. So the first would be just kind of getting under the bar, not really any retraction. The bar is kind of just sitting here, and actually it's very easy for it to move around, especially if you have weight on there. Now, when I get under the bar here, I'm really focusing on pulling my shoulder blades together and locking the bar in place. Now from here, the bar really has very little movement. It's pretty much locked into the shelf at the top of my upper back. So what you want to do is work on retraction drills. There's a bunch of different ones, and if you start implementing these into your training routine, you can get an improvement on here. For some people it's a motor skill, and for other people it's just a limitation. So the drills that you use have to address those things. And then I also mentioned external rotation. So if I don't have great external rotation, but if I have super poor external rotation, basically when I set the bar on my back, I'm kind of going to be forcing my center of mass forward, which makes the setup a little bit more difficult, especially if I'm pushing myself into this position. It also can create shoulder problems and elbow issues. So again, these are drills that you're going to want to put into your training, external rotation drills, to help improve that end range rotation to allow you to have a better setup. Once we actually have the setup, the second subject we're going to talk about is the walkout. A lot of room for error here. So I talked about trying to get maximum tension from the start. That's all well and good, but if you lose that in the walkout, it basically negates all the work that you've done. So the first part of this chain is the setup and locking the bar in place so it doesn't move around. The second part is holding it there, right? So oftentimes you'll see people kind of just get under, stand up, walk out before the bar even settles. And the whole time you're doing that, inertia is going to keep that weight moving, right? You don't really have control of it. You're just wasting energy, and just to put it plainly. So what you want to do is be very deliberate in the walkout. We teach a 3-step walkout that's very specific. It goes like this. You set your upper back. I stand up. I let the weight settle before I do anything. Once the weight is settled, my first step is straight back. My second step is to the side. And my third step is to wherever my squat stance is. I let the bar settle again before actually squatting. So the whole time I have control of the weight. It's never moving me around, and I'm saving as much energy as possible for the actual rep itself. We're going to go back to the computer and talk about some other topics. So the next topic we're going to talk about is related to bracing and bracing concepts. I'm not going to go into a full bracing overview. We have a whole lecture dedicated to that. Jordan also spoke about it in his mechanics lecture. So this is just a couple things that are very specifically applicable to squatting. The first thing I see often, it's related to bracing, but it's also just kind of related to positioning and torso position. I call it the curved column. If you watch Jordan's lecture on mechanics, you know that normal force is going to be pushing down on us when we have a load on our back. And we want to support that the best we can by keeping a stacked position, right? So basically I don't want to be like this if you're talking about a column, right? So then the normal force is then pushing down on an area where there's no mass supporting it. To put it plainly, it's just extension, which is the common thing that I see, the mechanic that people often do. So if you're overextending in your thoracic spine, you're going to have that curved column. Or if you're rotating your pelvis out, you're going to have that same thing. It's a very simple fix, but it's often hard to do. You want to pull your sternum down to your pelvis and keep it linked here the whole time, right? There's a whole lot more related to bracing than that, but this is just a common thing that I see people do that makes bracing a lot harder, and you're just working against yourself. So what you want to do is just practice, and taking a video of yourself is very helpful to see if you're doing this. Just practice keeping this locked down and then not extending when you squat. A lot of times people would do this in the setup, so they understand the concept of bracing, and they'll get set up and they'll brace down, but then as soon as they go to squat, they'll pull their sternum up and pull themselves into extension, just negating all the work that you've done actually bracing. So the next topic we're going to talk about is common faults that cause nonlinear bar path. If you watch Jordan's lecture on mechanic principles, you'll know that inertia states that something wants to keep moving in a straight line from the last place it imparted force. Basically what that means is if you're having to correct a nonlinear bar path, you're applying force to a vector that is not directly applicable to the range of motion in the squat. To put it even more plainly, you're just wasting energy trying to have to correct that position, because no matter what, the bar has to come back to your initial starting position. And if you're not moving in a linear path, if you're moving whatever it is on whatever path it is, that's just wasted energy. You'll be a more efficient squatter if you can get your bar path to be linear or as close to linear as possible. We should always be striving for that. And now I'm going to walk over to the platform and just demonstrate a couple things that can cause issues with the bar path. So the first fault we're going to talk about that often causes bar path issues is center of pressure. If you watch Jordan's lecture on mechanic principles, you'll know that he says the center of pressure is not the center of the foot. So I'm going to say something that's contradictory to what he said, but this is a general rule of thumb that most people are going to understand this by telling them that their center of pressure is the center of their foot. As you become a more seasoned squatter, you might find a variation in that, and everybody's different, so this might not apply to you, but for most people, they're going to get this right from the beginning by talking about it from the center of their foot. So basically, we want to be driving through the center of our foot throughout the whole range of motion. I don't want my center of pressure to shift towards my toe, and I don't want my center of pressure to shift towards my heel. Those are going to cause bar path issues. If you shift onto your toe, the bar is going to go like this. I'm going to end up over my toe, and then I'm going to have to correct it back to the start position. If I just keep my foot rooted in the middle, the bar is going to move in a perfectly straight line. Some other things that are worth taking a look at if you're having issues with this is your shoes. Heels versus flats. Heels can often exacerbate this issue and they can also mask the issue. They're convenient because they eliminate the ankle dorsiflexion requirement to squat. So some people have an ankle limitation that doesn't allow them to squat in flats, and they just go to heels. But then you don't really get a grasp on the concept of driving through the middle of your foot or keeping your center of pressure balanced. So if you're having this issue and you're wearing heels and you find yourself tippy-toeing, it might be worthwhile to go into flats for a little bit and kind of feel what it feels like to squat from a natural foot or a close to natural foot position. And then once you get a grasp on that, you can reintroduce the heels. You could play around with it, and it's worthwhile to examine these two different shoes to see where you can get the best result. Another thing you can implement for training to get a correction on this is tempo squats. So just slowing down the squat itself, you can actually feel if you're having a deviation in bar path, and you might be able to correct it in real time. And then over time, you can just drill that motor pattern, and it'll just become second nature. And then eventually, you'll be able to do it in real time. I often give people who have bar path issues tempo squats to try and get them to get a correction, to also feel what it feels like to squat in a linear path. Also, they might not even know that they're squatting with some kind of deviation in bar path, but then if you slow down the squat, they could feel it. And often if you feel it, you can know what you're trying to correct. I'm going to go back to the computer, and we're going to talk about some other topics. So the last thing we're going to talk about is squat stance and suboptimal squat stance that can be causing issues with your squat. There's no one correct stance. It's all based on individual physiology. So everybody's different, and everybody's squat is going to be different. A lot of times people try and mimic their favorite lifter squat, where they see something on YouTube or whatever. A high school coach told them something, and they just try and jam themselves into this one specific mold. But oftentimes it's very nuanced, and it often takes a little bit of trial and error to figure out what squat stance is correct for you. So some stances that, just a general rule of thumb that I see a lot of people have problems with, the two main ones are too wide or too narrow. So I'm just addressing the extreme ends of the spectrum of the stance. Oftentimes people will try a squat stance that's way too wide, and you'll see a lot of knee caving, and their hips aren't just plainly not made for that stance, and they causes a whole bunch of problems, and they can't hip depth. There's a whole bunch of issues with it. But basically, most people aren't going to benefit from having an extremely wide squat stance. And then on the flip side, just having a too narrow stance, again, is going to cause problems with limb lengths and hitting depth, balance issues. And for most people, their stance is going to be somewhere in between those two. So it takes a lot of playing around with, a lot of trial and error. A coach can definitely help you find the right one. But basically, don't get stuck on one specific stance and try and force yourself into that stance. Play with it, and then over time, you'll start to figure out what works best for you, where you can generate the most power, where you have a nice, clean bar path, and basically what feels comfortable to you. Thanks for watching, guys. I'm Coach Joe. If you liked it, please leave a comment or subscribe or share. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions, if you're looking for a coach. We'll see you soon.